Jack sat in his car, his fingers drumming nervously against the steering wheel. The quiet suburban street outside looked peaceful, with neat lawns and family cars parked in driveways. But Jack's mind was anything but calm. He couldn't stop replaying the events of the last few days, the shocking discovery that had shattered his life. He had known something was wrong for months. His wife, Claire, had been distant, distracted. She was always on her phone, claiming it was work-related, but Jack could feel it. The late nights, the excuses about meeting friends he'd never heard of, the coldness between them in bed. Everything pointed to the obvious, but he had pushed it aside, wanting to believe they could still fix things. Until the moment he found the proof he couldn't ignore. It had happened by accident, really. Claire had left her phone unattended on the kitchen counter, and when it buzzed with a message, Jack glanced over, his curiosity piqued. What he saw on the screen made his blood run cold. A text from a man named Ryan, filled with innuendo and references to their last meeting. Jack's heart had pounded in his chest as he scrolled through the conversation, seeing months of secret exchanges, photos, and plans to meet. The rage had been immediate, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to think clearly. Confronting Claire would only give her time to prepare her defense, to manipulate the situation. He needed to be smarter than that. He needed a plan. But there was one person he had to tell first. His best friend, Richard. Richard and Jack had been close for years, practically brothers. They'd built their lives side by side, marrying around the same time, starting families, and even living in the same neighborhood. Richard would understand the devastation, and maybe together they could figure out what to do next. Jack had no idea that when he finally confided in Richard, his friend would reveal a secret just as dark as his own. Jack turned off the car engine and walked up the path to Richard's house. The weight of betrayal hung heavy in his chest. He knocked on the door, his heart racing. Richard answered quickly, his face lighting up with the usual smile that faded the moment he saw Jack's expression. "What's going on?" Richard asked, stepping aside to let Jack in. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jack sat down heavily on the couch, his hands clenched into fists. "It's Claire," he began, his voice tight. "She's been cheating on me." Richard froze, his eyes wide with shock. "What? How do you know?" "I found the texts. Saw it with my own eyes. She's been sleeping with some guy for months, maybe longer." There was a pause as Richard processed the information. His jaw tightened, and then something strange happened. Instead of reacting with disbelief or anger on Jack's behalf, Richard exhaled slowly, a bitter smile creeping across his face. "Jack," he said quietly, "you're not alone." Jack blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Richard leaned forward, his voice low and strained. "My wife Emma, she's been cheating on me too. I found out about a year ago." The room seemed to close in on Jack as the reality of Richard's words sank in. He stared at his friend, stunned. "You knew? And you didn't say anything?" Richard's expression darkened. "I couldn't. I didn't know what to do. She made me feel like I was going crazy, like it was all in my head. But then I found the proof, and there was no denying it. She's been with someone else, Jack." For a long time, the two men sat in silence, the weight of their shared betrayal hanging between them. It was a strange, twisted bond they now shared, both victims of their wives' infidelity, both harboring the same pain and anger. But Jack wasn't one to sit in defeat. The wheels in his mind had already started turning, a plan forming in the depths of his fury. He looked at Richard, his voice cold and sharp. "We're not going to let them get away with this." Richard raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" "We're going to make them pay," Jack said, his voice steady. "We're going to sue for everything. Leave them with nothing. We'll destroy them." Richard's eyes lit up with a spark of agreement. He had spent months drowning in anger, unsure of how to channel it. But now, with Jack beside him, it felt like the pieces were falling into place. Revenge was no longer a distant fantasy. It was a plan. A dangerous, thrilling plan. Together, they began to plot their next move, unaware of just how twisted their path for revenge would become. Jack's mind raced as he and Richard sat together, the dim light of the living room casting shadows on their tense faces. The shock of their shared betrayal had turned into something sharper, darker. Their pain had transformed into a need for vengeance, a desire to watch their wives crumble under the weight of their own deceit. The two men had a bond now, one forged in betrayal and sharpened by rage. "We need proof," Jack said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but the anger simmered beneath the surface. "Enough to ruin them." Richard nodded slowly, his face pale but determined. "I've got some of that already. I've been collecting evidence for months. Texts, emails, photos of her meeting that guy when she said she was working late. I've been waiting for the right moment." Jack felt a surge of adrenaline. Richard had already done some of the groundwork. "We can use that," he said, leaning forward. "And I'll do the same for Claire. She's been sloppy lately. If I dig deeper, I'll find everything I need." The two men began to discuss their plan, working out every detail. They needed to act strategically, like predators stalking their prey. If they confronted their wives too soon, it could give them time to manipulate the situation. No, they had to be patient, to gather every piece of evidence and strike when their wives least expected it. As Jack drove home that night, the weight of what they were planning sat heavily on his chest. But beneath the dread, there was a spark of something else: satisfaction. They wouldn't just divorce their wives and walk away. They would leave them with nothing. Claire and Emma had played their twisted games, and now they were about to lose. Over the next few days, Jack threw himself into the task of collecting evidence against Claire. It wasn't hard. Her carelessness was staggering. She left her second phone, the one she thought he didn't know about, in her gym bag. Jack took it when she was asleep, scrolling through messages that made his blood boil. The texts were explicit, detailing their plans to meet in hotels, to lie to their spouses, and worst of all, their mockery of Jack. Claire had described him as boring, predictable, someone she could manipulate without him ever realizing. Jack's hands trembled as he read her words. The rage built like a storm inside him, but he forced himself to remain calm. Every piece of evidence was another nail in Claire's coffin. Soon, she would pay. At the same time, Richard was doing the same with Emma. The two men shared their findings, and as the evidence piled up, their determination grew. Their revenge would be calculated, meticulous, leaving no room for their wives to recover. It was almost too easy. But just as they began to feel confident, the first twist in their plan struck. One evening, as Jack was going through another batch of messages on Claire's phone, something strange caught his eye. A message not from Ryan, her lover, but from an unknown number. The tone was different, colder, more direct. It wasn't playful or flirtatious. It was a warning. "He's watching you. Be careful." Jack frowned, reading the message again. He scrolled back through the conversation and found more cryptic messages from the same number. All of them were filled with vague warnings, cautioning Claire about someone keeping an eye on her. Jack's pulse quickened. Who was watching? And why hadn't Claire told him anything? He couldn't ask her without giving away the fact that he had her phone, so he saved the number and decided to investigate on his own. The more he uncovered, the more it became clear that something else was going on behind the scenes, something more than just an affair. Meanwhile, Richard's situation was becoming just as complicated. One night, as he sat in his car, staking out Emma's latest meeting, he noticed something unusual. Emma wasn't alone with her lover. There was a third person, a man Richard didn't recognize, but someone who seemed to know both Emma and the lover intimately. The way they interacted, the way they kept looking over their shoulders, something was wrong. Richard took photos, capturing every moment, and drove home with a growing sense of unease. Who was that third man? Why was he involved in Emma's affairs? And why did he seem to be giving orders to both her and her lover? The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but it wasn't the picture Jack and Richard had expected. Their wives were hiding something much bigger than infidelity, and the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. But there was no turning back now. The air felt heavier as Jack sat in his office late at night, staring at the unknown numbers saved in his phone. The cryptic warnings to Claire nagged at him, pulling him in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Whoever this person was, they knew something important, and it wasn't just about the affair. His gut told him this went deeper than he'd imagined, but he wasn't sure how far he was willing to go to uncover the truth. He tapped the number into a search engine, but nothing came up. Frustrated, Jack thought about calling it directly. Would they answer? What would he even say? He hesitated, his finger hovering over the call button. Instead, he decided to text. It was less risky. Who is this? What are you warning Claire about? He hit send and stared at the screen, waiting for a response. Minutes passed. His nerves buzzed with anxiety, but then the phone buzzed. Stop looking into things you don't understand. It's not what you think. Jack's frustration boiled over. He had every right to know what was happening. His wife had betrayed him, lied to him for months, and now he was being warned off? No chance. I deserve to know the truth. Tell me who you are. He sent the message, his hands trembling with a mix of anger and fear. There was no reply this time. Jack felt a knot forming in his stomach. He knew that whoever was behind this wasn't going to give him answers easily. But now it was personal. He had thought the betrayal was limited to Claire's affair, but it was clear that this was only the surface. Something much darker lurked beneath. Meanwhile, Richard was unraveling his own set of twisted threads. He had reviewed the photos he took of Emma, her lover, and the mysterious third man. The way they interacted was off, like they were part of some scheme, something coordinated. This wasn't just some fling. It was calculated. But calculated for what? Richard couldn't shake the feeling that the third man was in control, orchestrating something beyond the affair. His suspicions only grew when he followed Emma the next day. Instead of meeting with her lover at a hotel, as she usually did, she went to an unfamiliar office building on the outskirts of the city. Richard parked at a distance, watching as Emma entered the building, her face tense and serious. She wasn't here for fun or romance. This was business. He waited for nearly an hour before she re-emerged, looking visibly shaken. He snapped more photos as she hurried to her car and drove off. Something was very, very wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The affair was only a small part of a much larger plan. Richard's mind raced as he considered the possibilities. Was Emma involved in something criminal? Was she being blackmailed? The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Whatever Emma and Claire were involved in, it was far from simple infidelity. There were layers to this. Layers that could destroy more than just their marriages. That night, Jack and Richard met again to compare notes, but the mood had shifted. Both men were tense, and the sense of solidarity that had united them before was now tainted by the growing paranoia. They were no longer dealing with simple betrayal. There was danger here, something neither of them had anticipated. Jack leaned forward, his voice low and serious. This isn't just about the affairs anymore, Richard. There's more going on. I've been getting these weird messages, and whoever it is, they know something. They're warning Claire about someone watching her. I think we've only scratched the surface. Richard frowned, pulling out his phone to show Jack the photos of Emma and the unknown man. You're not wrong. Look at this. Emma's meeting with this guy, and he's not her lover. He's someone else, someone in control. I followed her to an office building today. She looked scared when she left. They both sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their discoveries settling over them like a heavy fog. What had started as a plan for revenge had now turned into something far more dangerous. We need to be careful, Jack finally said, his voice tight with tension. If there are other people involved, people who don't want us to know what's going on, we're not just risking our marriages. We're risking everything. Richard nodded, his eyes hardening with resolve. Then we need to figure out who these people are. We need to find out what our wives are really involved in. But as they continued to dig deeper, the danger crept closer. The next day, Jack received a package at his doorstep. No note, no return address, just a plain brown envelope. His hands shook as he tore it open, revealing a stack of documents and photos. As he flipped through them, his stomach twisted into knots. There were photos of him, of Richard, taken from a distance, as if someone had been following them, watching them. There were copies of bank statements, tracking his financial transactions, emails between him and Richard. Every move they had made, every piece of evidence they had gathered, was documented in the file. At the bottom of the stack was a single message, printed in bold, black letters. Stop, or you'll both lose more than just your marriages. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the words. Whoever they were one step ahead. And now, the threat was real. He grabbed his phone and called Richard immediately. "We've got a problem," Jack said, his voice shaking. "They're watching us." Jack's heart raced as he stood in the middle of his living room, clutching the stack of documents that had just been delivered. He could feel the walls closing in. Every part of his life was under surveillance. His movements, his finances, even his private conversations with Richard. Whoever was behind this had been watching them for weeks, maybe even months. The idea that he had been blind to it for so long made him sick to his stomach. The plan for revenge, the anger that had fueled him and Richard. It all seemed so small now, overshadowed by the looming threat. They weren't just dealing with infidelity anymore. This was something else entirely, something much darker, and they were already caught in its web. He called Richard again, pacing as he waited for his friend to pick up. When Richard answered, Jack didn't waste time. "We're screwed," he said, his voice tight with panic. "I just got a package. They have everything, Richard. Photos of us, our bank statements, emails. They've been watching us this whole time." Richard's silence on the other end was deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but Jack could hear the tension in it. "They're trying to scare us. That's all it is. Intimidation." Jack stopped pacing, his fists clenched. "What if it's more than that? What if they really come after us? We don't know what these people are capable of." Richard sighed. "Look, we've come too far to back down now. Whatever they're trying to hide, it's bigger than just the affairs. We have to finish this." Jack's stomach twisted. He wanted to believe that Richard was right, that they could push through this and find a way to expose the truth. But the fear gnawed at him. Every instinct told him that they were in over their heads. "We need to meet," Jack said, his voice low. "I don't want to talk about this over the phone anymore. Let's meet at the park in an hour. We'll figure out what to do next." Richard agreed, and Jack hung up, his mind buzzing with paranoia. He double-checked the locks on his doors and windows, suddenly feeling like there were eyes on him everywhere. He had to stay one step ahead, but the more they uncovered, the more he realized how little control they had. Later that afternoon, Jack arrived at the park, scanning the area nervously as he approached the secluded bench where they had agreed to meet. Richard was already there, sitting stiffly, his expression unreadable. Jack sat down next to him, glancing around to make sure no one was watching them. "Did you bring the package?" Richard asked quietly. Jack nodded, pulling the envelope from his bag. He handed it to Richard, watching as his friend sifted through the documents, his face hardening with every page he turned. "Jesus," Richard muttered. "They know everything." Jack swallowed hard, his hands shaking. "We can't keep digging like this. They'll come for us if we get any closer." Richard shook his head. "No, we're not stopping now. We're going to keep going. We'll find out who these people are, and we'll expose them. We're not backing down." Jack's gut twisted with anxiety. Richard's determination was admirable, but it was dangerous. Whoever these people were, they had power. Enough to ruin both of their lives with a single blow. And if they had already been tracking them for this long, it was only a matter of time before things got worse. Suddenly, a voice interrupted their tense conversation. "Gentlemen." Both Jack and Richard whipped around to see a man standing a few feet away, his face hidden in the shadow of a baseball cap. He was tall, well-built, and had the air of someone who knew how to handle himself. Everything about him screamed danger. The man took a step closer, his voice low and measured. "You've been asking too many questions. It's time for you both to walk away." Richard stood up, his body tense with anger. "Who the hell are you? What do you want from us?" The man smirked, his eyes cold. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you need to do. Stop looking and let this go. You're already in deep enough." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment they had been dreading. He could feel the threat hanging in the air, unspoken but undeniable. "And if we don't?" Richard challenged, his fists clenched. The man's smile disappeared. "If you don't, you'll lose everything. Your money, your homes, your reputations. Maybe more." Jack's breath hitched. He could feel the weight of the threat pressing down on him like a vice. His mind raced, trying to figure out how they had gotten to this point. What had started as a plan for revenge had spiraled into something they could no longer control. The man took a step back, tipping his hat slightly as if to signal the end of the conversation. "Walk away while you still can." And then he was gone, leaving Jack and Richard standing there, stunned and shaken. The reality of the situation crashed over them like a tidal wave. "We need to stop," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard turned to him, his eyes burning with anger. "No, we're not stopping. Not after everything they've done." Jack shook his head. "It's too dangerous. You heard him. They'll ruin us." Richard grabbed Jack by the arm, his grip tight. "We've already lost everything, Jack. Our marriages are destroyed, and now we know our wives are involved in something bigger than we thought. We can't just walk away." Jack stared at his friend, torn between fear and loyalty. Richard was right. They had already lost so much. But the cost of continuing this path could be far worse than anything they had imagined. "I'll do this alone if I have to," Richard said, his voice hard. "But I'm not giving up." Jack swallowed hard, his mind spinning. He had come this far with Richard, shared the same pain, the same betrayal. He couldn't abandon him now, but as he nodded reluctantly, he knew in his heart that they were walking into a storm that might destroy them both. The tension in the car was unbearable as Jack drove home from the park, his mind spinning with everything that had just happened. Richard had been adamant. There was no turning back, no stopping. But the warning from the mysterious man was still ringing in Jack's ears. Walk away, or lose everything. The choice was clear, and yet, his loyalty to Richard pulled him in the opposite direction. Jack pulled into his driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the darkened windows of his house. Claire was inside, no doubt pretending that everything was fine, blissfully unaware of how close they had come to exposing the truth. But Jack knew that the storm was only beginning. His phone buzzed with a new message from Richard. "We keep going. Meet me tomorrow." Jack stared at the message, his heart heavy. He didn't respond. For the first time since they had started this, Jack felt the weight of the consequences bearing down on him. He had never intended for things to get this dangerous. Revenge had seemed so simple at the beginning. Destroy their cheating wives, take everything. But now, they were playing with forces far beyond their control. Jack slipped out of the car and headed inside, trying to ignore the knot of dread tightening in his stomach. The next morning, Jack found himself unable to focus at work. His thoughts kept drifting back to Richard, to the warning, to the man in the park. He didn't trust this anymore. What if Richard's stubbornness got them both killed? Or worse, what if they ended up as the ones being destroyed? The people they were up against had already proven that they could ruin their lives with the snap of a finger. As the day dragged on, Jack made a decision. He couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't let Richard drag him deeper into this madness. It was time to cut his losses and walk away. But when Jack called Richard that afternoon, there was no answer. He tried again. Nothing. Panic flickered at the edges of his mind. Richard had been reckless, sure, but he wasn't the type to disappear. Something was wrong. Jack drove to Richard's house, his heart pounding in his chest. When he arrived, the place was eerily quiet. Richard's car was in the driveway, but the lights in the house were off. Jack's stomach churned as he knocked on the door, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios. After a moment, the door creaked open, and Jack stepped inside. "Richard," he called, his voice echoing through the darkened hallway. No response. Jack moved deeper into the house, his senses on high alert. Something was off. The air felt thick with tension, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. As he reached the living room, he froze. There, on the floor, was Richard. Jack rushed to his side, his pulse pounding in his ears. Richard was unconscious, his face pale and bruised. A trail of blood seeped from a cut on his forehead. Panic surged through Jack as he shook his friend, trying to wake him. "Richard! Richard, wake up!" Slowly, Richard's eyes fluttered open, and he groaned in pain. Jack's relief was short-lived as he noticed the crumpled envelope in Richard's hand. Jack snatched it up, his heart sinking as he read the note inside. Jack's hands trembled as he crumpled the note in his fist. This was no longer just a threat. It was a promise, and Richard was too stubborn to see it. "They came after you," Jack said, his voice thick with disbelief. "They're not playing anymore, Richard." Richard coughed, wincing in pain as he tried to sit up. "I don't care," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "They think they can scare us, but I'm not backing down." Jack stared at his friend in shock. "Are you serious? They nearly killed you, and you're still going to keep pushing?" Richard's eyes blazed with defiance. "They're trying to protect something, Jack. Something big. That's why they're so desperate to stop us. And that's exactly why we can't back down now." Jack's frustration boiled over. "You're going to get us both killed." This was never about exposing something bigger. It was about revenge. "We're not equipped to deal with whatever this is." Richard shook his head. "It's too late for that. We're in this now, and I'm not stopping until I know the truth." Jack felt a surge of anger, but also something else, a deep sense of fear. Richard was right about one thing. They had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. But Jack wasn't willing to pay the price. Not anymore. "I'm done," Jack said, standing up. "I can't do this. I have a family, and I'm not going to risk losing everything for a fight we can't win." Richard glared at him, his jaw clenched. "So you're just going to walk away? Let them win?" Jack nodded, his voice firm. "Yes, I'm walking away." Without another word, Jack turned and left the house, leaving Richard behind. The fear and paranoia that had been gnawing at him for days now burned brighter than ever. He had to protect himself. He had to protect his life, his future. Walking away wasn't just the smart move. It was the only move. But as Jack drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. The web they had uncovered was too tangled, too dangerous. And even though he had chosen to walk away, he wasn't sure he could ever truly escape it. Jack thought he had escaped. He had severed ties with Richard, distanced himself from the danger, and tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. But as the days passed, a gnawing sense of dread settled deep in his gut. Something was still wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that walking away wasn't enough. The fear lingered, and no matter how hard he tried to move on, the darkness of what they'd uncovered clung to him like a shadow. Every night, Jack double-checked his locks, peering out the windows, scanning the street for anyone suspicious. But it wasn't just the paranoia that aided him. It was guilt. Guilt for abandoning Richard when his friend needed him most. Guilt for leaving the plan unfinished. Then, one evening, Jack's phone buzzed with an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat as he stared at the screen. He didn't want to answer, but the feeling in his gut told him he had no choice. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Hello?" A familiar voice, low and steady, spoke on the other end. "Jack, it's me. Richard." Jack's stomach tightened. He hadn't heard from Richard since the night he walked away, and now the sound of his voice sent a shiver down Jack's spine. "Richard, I thought you. I need you to meet me. There's something you need to see. I found everything. The truth. I'm sending you an address. Be there in an hour." Jack hesitated, a million alarms going off in his head. But before he could respond, the line went dead, and a message with the address appeared on his screen. Jack stared at it, torn between fear and curiosity. Richard had nearly been killed, yet he was still pushing forward. Whatever he had found, it had to be big, bigger than either of them had imagined. And as much as Jack wanted to run the other way, something inside him, something primal, demanded closure. An hour later, Jack found himself driving down a narrow, secluded road on the outskirts of town. The trees loomed overhead, casting dark shadows as he followed the directions to an old, abandoned warehouse. The place looked like it hadn't been used in years, its windows shattered and the exterior covered in graffiti. Jack parked his car and stepped out, his heart pounding in his chest. He scanned the area nervously, but there was no sign of Richard. The silence was deafening. He walked toward the entrance, his footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement. As he approached the door, his phone buzzed again. It was another message from Richard. Inside, Jack pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped into the warehouse. The place was dimly lit, dust swirling in the air. His footsteps echoed through the empty space, and a sense of dread settled over him like a heavy blanket. Something was wrong. "Richard?" Jack called out, his voice shaky. No response. He ventured deeper into the warehouse, his senses on high alert. And then, he saw it. a figure standing in the center of the room, motionless. It wasn't Richard. The figure turned slowly, and Jack's blood ran cold. It was the same man from the park, the enforcer. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto Jack as a small smile crept across his face. "You should have walked away, Jack," the man said, his voice dripping with menace. "But now it's too late." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away, but it was already too late. The doors slammed shut behind him, and the sound of footsteps echoed from the shadows. More figures emerged from the darkness, 3, 4, 5 men, all dressed in black, surrounding him. The enforcer stepped forward, his smile widening. "You and Richard were digging where you shouldn't have, and now you'll pay the price." Jack's mind raced. This was a setup, a trap? But why? What did they want? He had already walked away, given up the search. Why come after him now? "Where's Richard?" Jack demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The enforcer chuckled darkly. "Richard? He's already taken care of." Jack's stomach twisted in horror. "What did you do to him?" The enforcer stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "You really thought you could beat us, didn't you? That you could expose something bigger than yourself?" He shook his head slowly. "You're just a pawn, Jack. A loose end we need to tie up." Jack's heart pounded in his ears. He was trapped, and there was no way out. He had to think fast, had to find a way to survive. But before he could react, the enforcer snapped his fingers, and the men lunged toward Jack. The next few minutes were a blur of panic and pain. Jack fought desperately as the men closed in, fists flying, bodies colliding. He barely had time to think, his instincts taking over as he struggled to fend them off. But there were too many, and they were too strong. They overpowered him, pinning him to the cold concrete floor. His head slammed against the ground, sending stars exploding behind his eyes. Blood dripped from his nose, his breath coming in ragged gasps as they held him down. The enforcer loomed over him, his expression cold and detached. "You should have left it alone," he said softly, almost pityingly. "But now, you'll lose everything." Jack's vision blurred as the men dragged him across the floor, his body limp and battered. He could barely register what was happening as they pulled him toward a small, enclosed room in the corner of the warehouse. They threw him inside, slamming the door shut behind them. Jack lay there in the darkness, gasping for breath, his mind spinning. He was trapped. And Richard, what had they done to him? Was he still alive? Or had they already killed him? His body ached, but his mind refused to give up. He had to think of a way out. He couldn't die here. Not like this. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. Jack's heart skipped a beat, expecting another attack. But it wasn't one of the enforcers. It was Richard. Jack blinked in disbelief, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. Richard stepped closer, his face pale but determined. "They think they've won," Richard said quietly, his voice hoarse. "But they underestimated us." Jack stared at him, his head spinning. "What are you talking about? How are you still alive?" Richard knelt beside him, a small smile playing on his lips. "Because I set them up, Jack. I knew they'd try something like this, so I planned ahead." Jack's mind reeled as he struggled to sit up. "You set them up?" Richard nodded, his eyes gleaming with a fierce determination. "I found out who they were working for, who's behind all of this, and I made sure we had leverage. Something they couldn't ignore." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. "What leverage?" Richard smiled grimly. "I recorded everything. All the meetings, all the threats. I have enough evidence to bring them down, and they know it." Jack's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. Richard had played them. He had anticipated their moves, prepared for the inevitable confrontation, and now they had the upper hand. "But how do we get out of here?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. Richard's smile widened. "I've already made the call. Help is on the way." And just as he spoke, the distant wail of police sirens echoed through the warehouse. The enforcers had no idea what was coming for them.